Hi, this is Sam Welker with ThinkParticle.com, and in this video we're going to be talking about the TP Toolkit. This is the visual documentation series in which you can learn how to use each object in the TP Toolkit, and if you haven't watched our first video, go ahead and check that out first. So in this video we're talking about a plugin for Cinema 4D, again called the TP Toolkit. And you can find that at thinkparticle.com. It's this really powerful tool and quite affordable tool for using thinking particles in your scenes. And we're going to go ahead and talk about the TPMograph object in this scene. So that is an emitter that will allow you to emit from objects. And there we go. So you can emit particles from an object, and it's a lot more complicated than our last video we talked about, the TP simple emitter. In this video, we're going to talk about how you can emit from an object, from the surface or the volume, and add some variety with Mograph effectors. So to go ahead and add that to the scene, we're going to go ahead and go to the TP Toolkit plugin under our plugins menu. And again, just select that object and hit add and close, okay? Then we're going to have our thinking particle settings, and we're going to go ahead and just drag in the TP Toolkit group. So I'm going to reset all these values. Okay, so we have our particle group, and we're going to have to drag that in, and we have to do that manually, and once that's done, we have our group that will, our particles will be born out of. Okay, so the next thing we're going to want to do is set our emitter. Okay, and that's under particle emitter, and then we're going to talk about the rest of the values now. So once you hit play, oops, we're going to need to give it a little bit of speed, life. Okay. So once you hit play, these particles are going to start coming out of your object. And these are all emitting from the surface. So you can enable or disable the emitter by checking and unchecking the emitter enabled box. And we will talk about the Mograph objects, or the Mograph features, at the very end. You have your particle group, which allows you to kind of, it's like a family of particles. It's like their last name. And anytime you call that last name, those particles will respond and obey. So you can emit from the surface of an object or the volume of an object. And you can check those, or you can select those right there. You can select your object, and in this case we're using a platonic. Now, if you add an object to the scene and to your emitter and it's not working, make sure it's editable, okay? It won't work with parametric objects, which means an object that is generated in Cinema 4D that is not editable. So next, you can set your particles per second. This is how many particles come out per second. In my case, 30 frames per second. In yours, it might be 25 or 24 or 12, depending on your project. So you can set those settings right here by hitting Control D and setting FPS in your project, and then you're going to want to go to your render settings and go to your output and matching that right there. Okay, so we can go ahead and hit play, and we can have a lot of particles or less particles or just one particle per second, and that can emit from the volume or the surface. Okay, so we can start the emission on, we can set when we start and end emission. So if we want to emit only for the first 30 frames, we can go ahead and set that, or we can set it to emit only for the first frame. We can set it to emit only on frame 15. Okay, we can set it to go from frame 15 to 30 with these values. These are basically saying, I want you to be born, I want particles to only be born between these frames right here. Okay. We're going to add some more particles so we can give a better example of that. Okay. So we're going to set those back to the values that they should be at. And then we're going to have our life. So as we talked about in the TP Simple video, if you have already seen that, you can go ahead and skip all these next parts until we get to the Mograph. But if you haven't seen that yet, the life is how long the particles live for. So say a particle's life is 30 frames, that particle will be born and die within 30 frames of its birth. It will die 30 frames after it's born, okay? We can add some variation to that and that is going to say basically, hey particle, your frame, or you have a 30 frame lifespan, but because we have variation, you're going to be dying at frame 12. And then another particle is going to die at frame 16, and another particle is going to die at frame 1. So basically, you're going to take the value right here, the lifespan, and if you have 100% variation, it will go between frame 0, or from 0 frames and 30 frames of a lifespan. If you set it to 50, it will go between 15 and 30 frames of a lifespan, and so on and so forth like that. So again, if you have 100 frames for a lifespan and you set it to 50, the particles will emit from 50 to 100 frames of life. If you set it to 75, it will go from 25 frames to 100 frames, and such like that. So you get the idea. So we're going to leave that at 30 and 100. Okay, and the speed works in a similar way. This is going to take the velocity of the particle, and velocity is a basic calculation, a fundamental of physics. So you're going to take your velocity, and if you have no velocity in a scene, your particles aren't going to move. Okay, you need to have some velocity to move them. So one way we do that is by just setting their initial speed. The speed is set, I think a normal speed value from the objects is usually set to 100. In our toolkit, you can set that to 1,000. You can set that to 10, and they'll move really slow. This is basically how fast they travel. So we can set the speed to 150, and again, like the life, we can set the variation. And when you set your lifespan and have the variation, it's going to say how long a particle lives for. If you set your speed variation, it's going to say how fast it travels. So the fastest particle will be 150 units traveling in the z-axis of our object right here, or along that object's z-axis, or you will have other particles that don't travel at any velocity because they are set to 0. Okay, so if we set that to 50, we'll have particles traveling at 75 units all the way up to 150 units, and they will be randomly selected and given those values by the computer. Exciting stuff. So the X FOV and the Y FOV are basically going to set the cone, the emission cone. So we're going to make this object small so we can really visualize this. We're going to give it a cone value, a degree value of 60 degrees in variation of direction. So particles are going to move just along the z-axis of their object until we give them FOV values. So if you give them FOV values in the x-axis, they're going to move along the x and the z-axis, okay? But they won't be moving along the y-axis. And if you give them a variation in the y-axis, then they're not going to move in the x-axis. They're going to take the position they're born at and move in the z and the y-axis. And they're going to have, basically you're going to give them their value, and that's in this case 180 degrees. So they're going to move anywhere in the positive y-axis or the negative y-axis, and they will move along the z-axis, in the positive z-axis in this case. If we set that to 360, then they're going to move in every direction along the y and the z-axis. So that will give us a cone that will, say in this case 35, they're going to take their position and move along that axis. And because the object is as big as it is, it's going to be a little bit harder to tell the direction. So if we set it to 90, that'll give you a better idea. Okay, so if we set both of those to 90, then, well, before we set them to 90, you can see that they're moving along the z and the y-axis, but not the x-axis because we only had variation on the y-axis. So now we have variation on every axis, on the x and the z-axis, and because we have speed variation, technically they also have a variation on the z-axis. So that is how that works, to give variation and variety to the particles, and that makes them look a lot better. So the next thing we're going to talk about is the Mograph emitter, or I guess the Mograph integration. So we have a shader effector right here, and we've turned off all the parameters. Well, almost all the parameters. Now they're all off. We don't use any parameters from here. We're just going to use the shader, and we're going to use a noise. And this noise value is going to be a wavy turbulence, which is going to, we'll go ahead and just create a new one. We're going to create a new noise value, okay? And we're going to set the scale. We need to do that one more time. Noise, okay, set the scale to something a little bigger maybe, and set it to wavy turbulence. Set it to whatever you like, but this is what we're going to do in this video. And we're going to set it to have an animation speed of 2, and add a little bit of low clip and high clip values. So what's going to happen now is we're going to take basically anywhere between the black and the white settings, and those are going to get multiplied, where the black settings are going to add, or anything that is, I guess, think about it this way. The shader effector is going to pick a point, the center of this image, as an example, the 1 pixel, and it's going to take that value. It's going to be black or white or somewhere in between, and white is a 1 and black is a 0. Actually, technically, I think it's reversed the way it works right now, but anywhere between black and white, it will take that value at that pixel, and because we have that animation speed, that's going to change over time. So let's go ahead and look. Say right here at the mouse pointer, that's changing, and that's going to use that value and multiply that value by the settings we have here to control those settings. So when we go ahead and check Mograph enabled, that's not going to allow us to do anything because we haven't put our shader effector in yet, or any effector. So we need to go ahead and add our effector, and because of how it works, we're going to have to set or turn down our settings really quick. So the XFOV and the YFOV are going to go over these amounts right here because they're affected so strongly. Okay. But if we want to not have the XFOV or the YFOV affected and keep them at 90 degrees, then we're going to go ahead and just turn the Mograph affected percentage down. And this is going to apply to our speed and our life and the particle emission count. So if we're going to emit 150 particles per frame, and then we add the Mograph affected value, it's going to change how many particles are emitted per frame. Actually per second, but per frame it will adjust that per second value depending on the value of the noise. You can use a random effector and other things like the sound effector, which is a great one to control thinking particles like this. So there you go. That is how that works. So we talked about turning on and off our emitter and adding the Mograph effectors to control them, to control our emitters. We talked about adding particle groups. We talked about emitting from the surface or a volume, how to set up the object and prepare it so we can emit from it. We talked about how many particles per second and per frame we can emit. We talked about affecting that with Mograph. We talked about the first and end frame and the path between, basically, that the particles will be emitted. So saying emit particles between the start and end frame. We talked about the life of particles, the life variation. We talked about the speed of particles and variation to those as well, and adding Mograph variation to both of those. We talked about the FOV values to give direction variation under certain restricted degrees and axes. So that is the TPMograph object. And thank you for watching this. You can learn more about the TP Toolkit and get your own copy at thinkparticle.com if you haven't already done such. And you can find the rest of the series there as well. And I'm Sam Welker, and I'll see you guys later.